If you want to know how to more effectively and more easily memorize information, then you're in the right place. Many people find memorization to be difficult and tedious, but in today's episode, I'm going to share with you some of the best techniques that I've learned for memorizing difficult information that has allowed me to recall it even over a decade later. And the best part is, it doesn't require flashcards. My name is Josh, and this is Engineering a Better Education. I want to start by discussing how our brains work. So, our brains are designed to filter between information that's important and all the other mundane, unimportant noise. And that's a good thing, because if our brains remembered every single little thing, then I think that'd be really overwhelming for us. So you probably don't remember things like what you had for breakfast 10 days ago, because your brain probably decided that wasn't important information to remember. However, you remember important events in your life, like marriage, the day you graduated high school, because those events were more unusual, they stood out, and your brain decided that they were important and worth remembering. So the key to memorizing information is figuring out how to make your brain decide that something's important. And the tricky thing here is that we don't get full conscious control over what our brain decides is important and what's unimportant. We can influence it by using certain techniques and practices, but ultimately that's a subconscious brain decision that determines whether information needs to be easily recalled for later or not. And there are a variety of reasons that your brain might decide something is important enough to recall. Today we're going to discuss just a couple of those. So one is information that is familiar. And this is information that, for example, is like your name, your address, the words in the language that you speak, math skills, the ability to add and subtract numbers. All of these things are familiar. They've become a part of you to the degree that your brain knows this information is really important and needs to be able to be recalled at any time, any place, easily. So that's one of the reasons that your brain might make certain pieces of information really easy to recall. Another reason is when things are extremely unusual or outlandish. And that's because, like I said, your brain is designed to filter between important things and unimportant things. So there's a lot of noise and a lot of mundane activities that happen every day, like eating lunch, driving to work. You probably don't remember what your drive to work was like a week ago, what you ate for lunch a week ago, because it happens every single day. It's not important. But if you have an unusual lunch experience or an unusual drive to work, maybe a car accident or something like that, then your brain's going to make that information easier to recall because it was different from the other experiences that you've had. So those are two reasons that your brain will decide to make something easy to recall. Either it's so familiar and it's become a part of you, so much so that it's easy to recall and natural to recall, or it's so unusual and outlandish that your brain decides this is important, we're going to flag it, put a marker on it so that you can recall it later. And I think the best way to remember something long term is that familiarity route. However, that's really difficult to get to. I'll give you a simple example. I speak Spanish, and when I was in high school and junior high, I was taking Spanish classes, and I would memorize words, right? Vocabulary. And the way that I would do this when I was in high school and studying Spanish was things like flashcards or writing down the word in English and the word in Spanish and studying the list. And it was a lot of brute force memorization. And I would memorize the words for the exam. And then after the exam, I would remember some of the words, but definitely not all of them. A lot of them I would forget. However, I had the opportunity to live in a Spanish-speaking country. I was a missionary for 2 years, so I went to Argentina, and I was basically just thrown into the country and told to teach people. I was there to teach about my religious beliefs and to teach about Jesus Christ. And there was basically nobody who spoke English around me. So I was thrown in, forced to learn Spanish, and I used it every single day for 2 years. And now I don't use Spanish very often. I still use it occasionally, but I can recall basically all the words that I need to have a conversation with somebody. And that's because when I was in high school, my brain decided that these Spanish words were more or less not important enough to remember long term. I could recall them for the test, and then once that was over, my brain didn't hold on to them. However, when I was using Spanish every single day, my brain decided this is really important because it's the only way that we can communicate with people, the only way that I can talk to people or understand them. So that information became really important. It became crucial for survival, honestly. So that's an example of where that level of familiarity will make you recall something for years or decades. I'm sure that until the day that I die, I will remember how to speak Spanish. And it gets a little rusty sometimes if I haven't spoken in a while, but it doesn't take long to start speaking and recall that information again. So the best thing you can do if you want to remember something really well long term is application of the knowledge. I want to make sure that you know about my special coaching offer called Design a Product People Want, because I teach teenage students who are interested in STEM and who want to become a real engineer without waiting until after college. I teach them how to design a product that people want. They identify a problem that is worth solving to them, that they're passionate about, and I teach them how to innovate a solution to that problem. They iterate upon their prototypes until they've come up with a good, solid solution, and then they gain the confidence to sell or share their work with others. And this is a very immersive, hands-on experience, and so students who go through this program are going to remember it for the rest of their life, and they will become a real engineer without waiting until after college. So if you're interested in learning more about this program, check out the link in the description below, and there's a form that you can fill out that will help me to learn a little bit more about you and figure out why you want to be in this coaching program, and we can set up a call to discuss more details and learn more about it. So once again, check out the link in the description if you're interested in learning more about that. Going back to the two ways that our brains recall information, we talked about the familiarity aspect, and that takes a lot of time. In almost every case, you need exposure over time in order to remember something that well. However, there's the other aspect that I talked about, which is your brain will remember things that are extremely unusual or outlandish. So I want to share a technique with you that I use to memorize information. And this is when I need to memorize information and I don't have a lot of time to be exposed to it every day. So I used this when I was in school. It worked really well, helped me score well on exams, and helped me academically. I call it the Alice in Wonderland method. So if you're familiar with the movie or the story of Alice in Wonderland, I'll just do a brief recap. It's about a girl who goes to another world, essentially, and she has experiences and run-ins with a bunch of different characters. And if I were to ask you who the most memorable characters are in Alice in Wonderland, you'd probably say something like the Cheshire Cat, the Mad Hatter, the Queen of Hearts, the Smoking Caterpillar. These characters are all really memorable from the show, but there are several other characters that are not very memorable. If I were to ask you which animal or which pet Alice in Wonderland has in her real world, you might be able to tell me that it's a cat. I couldn't have told you that without rewatching Alice in Wonderland. Or if I were to ask you who the other human is in Alice's real world experience, you maybe would be able to tell me that it's a woman who is like a school teacher or a mentor, a tutor. But once again, I wouldn't have been able to tell you that without rewatching Alice in Wonderland. Additionally, there's a character, he's just like a guy with a hammer and red hair that shows up early into her experience in Alice in Wonderland. Once again, not a very memorable character. And what's the difference between the memorable characters and the non-memorable ones? Well, the ones who you remember are the most unusual and outlandish characters. So the Cheshire Cat, for example, is this almost creepy cat that has a big smile on its face, and he can turn parts of his body invisible, and his head turns upside down and his head floats around, and it's very weird. And so as soon as as a kid, I remember thinking Alice in Wonderland was a really creepy story because it had this strange Cheshire Cat in there and some other characters that were really strange. But you always remember the Cheshire Cat because he's different. Same with the Smoking Caterpillar. The Smoking Caterpillar doesn't get that much screen time really, but he's strange. He's this big, long, giant caterpillar that's smoking and saying weird nursery rhymes, and while he's saying them, the smoke coming out of his mouth is creating like these images that are happening in front of Alice. Really, really strange character, but you remember him really well. So the Alice in Wonderland technique, it means that you create images in your mind, vivid images of strange, outlandish, unusual things that are related to the information you're trying to memorize. So I'll give you a concrete example, and one way that I used this when I was in high school, I was in a pharmacy technician's class, and we had to memorize the brand name and generic name of 200 drugs. So you learn the brand name and you need to associate it with the generic name. And sometimes they sound similar and sometimes they have nothing to do with each other. So one example is the drug whose brand name is Bactrim and whose generic name is sulfamethoxazole trimethoprim. So they don't seem to have a lot in common with each other, those two names. And the generic name, frankly, is really difficult to remember because it has a lot of syllables and they're seemingly random syllables. But this is one of the drugs that I remember even over a decade later and probably will remember for the rest of my life. We'll see. But when I was in this pharmacy technician class, we would take 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of every class to learn the new drug names and then to come up with ways to remember them. And the way that I remember this drug name is, as I mentioned, the brand name is Bactrim. And so when I hear Bactrim, it sounds like the two words back and trim. So this is going to sound really weird. And I'll tell you, if you're doing the Alice in Wonderland method correctly, it's probably going to be a little bit embarrassing to share your mental images and associations because people are going to realize what kind of weird things are going on inside here in your brain. But it works really well. So when I hear back trim, I think of somebody's back getting shaved, like the hair off of their back getting shaved, a back trim. And the generic name is sulfamethoxazole trimethoprim. So there's the word prim in there. And I think of Prim from the Hunger Games. She's one of the main characters. So I have this image of somebody's back getting trimmed and Prim from the Hunger Games. So what I see in my mind is Sasquatch or Bigfoot, like big hairy creature. And I see Prim from the Hunger Games trimming Bigfoot, Sasquatch's back. And the rest of the words in the generic name, sulfamethoxazole. So I hear sulfa, meth, ox. So while Prim is trimming Sasquatch's back, there's an ox. And I have to say this without it coming across too weird. Sulfa meth. So I imagine this ox standing in a bathtub of sulfur. which I don't really know what that looks like, but I imagine like this like yellow liquid or yellow powder, and the ox is smoking. There's the word meth in there. So I just kind of envision like drugs. So this ox is standing in a bathtub full of sulfur, and it's smoking. And the second word in the generic name is trimethoprim. So then I imagine this ox speaking in like a Shakespearean like tone or language, saying trimeth, O Prim. So the ox is addressing Prim from the Hunger Games, saying trimeth, O Prim, while he's smoking. So that's the image that I have in my mind. I hear back trim, and I see Prim from the Hunger Games trimming Sasquatch's back while there's an ox standing in a bathtub of sulfur, smoking and saying trimeth, O Prim. So then as soon as I hear back trim, I see that image in my brain, and I know there's an ox, there's sulfur, there's meth, and trimethoprim. So, and all I need to do is hear sulfamethoxazole trimethoprim a few times to where all it takes is that image, and my brain immediately jumps to that. It's sulfamethoxazole trimethoprim. So, and it stuck with me. It's been over a decade since I took that class, and I hear back trim, and immediately I can recall that. So that is an example of how you can use the Alice in Wonderland method to remember information and recall it years later. You're going to burn this image, this strange image, into your brain. So I don't know if that's for better or for worse, but you create this outlandish, strange image that is so unusual that your brain says, this is something important. We don't see this every day. We don't imagine things like this every day. You know, we get so caught up in the mundane work, school things that to see an image so strange, your brain is like, okay, this must be important. We got to remember this and be able to recall it later. So you're almost using like a hack. You're playing this game to trick your brain into remembering something. And then when it comes time to recall that information, a trigger word like back trim will bring that image back to your mind. You're going to see the image, and you're going to remember the parts that make up that image. So this works really well for relating things together, relating words together or items. And it can also be used to remember lists of information, because you can create this outlandish, vivid, unusual story in your brain where different events happen, and each item in the list is associated with one of those events. Now, when you go back through and you play out this video in your mind, this moving image, and you reach each event, it's going to help you remember what the item in the list is associated with that event. So you'll not only remember the items in the list, but also the order that they occur. So I invite you to give this a try. Once again, I think the best way to remember things long-term is to apply information. So if you're learning something, especially like math, ditch the flashcards. Don't do flashcards. Apply the information. Solve real problems using those math skills, and they're going to stick with you. And alternatively, if you are stuck in a situation where you do need to memorize lists of information or associate items together, flashcards are really popular and you can get them to work, but it's kind of a brute force method. You just have to spend a lot of time, a lot of repetition. They're not very fun, and you'll have more success. You can still quiz yourself with flashcards, but if you use this Alice in Wonderland technique that I've explained, you'll be able to recall information a lot easier and a lot better. So I invite you to give it a try. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, if it's been helpful and meaningful for you, I invite you to leave a comment below answering the question, what is the most difficult thing that you've memorized, and what technique did you use to be able to memorize and recall that information? And once again, if you enjoyed the episode, I invite you to like and subscribe, and I will be seeing you soon. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.